Earlier this week, the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Nigeria confirmed one case of anthrax disease in a mixed livestock farm in Niger State. This is the first animal case to be reported in Nigeria since the beginning of the West Africa outbreak in Ghana in June. The sudden death of livestock in this fateful farm with 8 mortality was reported. In addition, the animals which died were observed to have been bleeding from external orifices without blood clotting. Investigation is ongoing to trace the source of the infection and to identify the spread to other farms and humans. Joining us now to look at the magnitude of the implications of the failings to stop the situation on its tracks is Dr. Blossom Maduafokwa, a family health physician and public relations officer of Association of Public Health Physicians of Nigeria, Lagos chapter. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, very good. Now, we saw the early signs in West Africa,
yes.
Ghana, but in regard to this, slowly creeping into Nigeria, how would you assess our state of preparedness before now?
Okay, so it was interesting because we did get the advisory following what had happened in Ghana, and the usual protocol will be to increase surveillance activities, which will be to begin to look more closely at farms that rear animals, to start observing, are we having sick animals, are the animals dying in a particular way. So surveillance activities should have been heightened as soon as we identify those cases in Ghana.
And it's unfortunate that we weren't able to preempt this, but as it is right now, just for individuals out there that might not be very well versed in, what exactly does this anthrax poisoning do to humans, to animals? How does it manifest itself, and where do you even find it? Where did it come from?
So anthrax is an infection that actually occurs primarily in animals. So it occurs in animals that we call herbivores, so animals that feed on grass, so like your cattle, your sheep, your goats, and then even in the wild, antelopes, deer also get infected with anthrax. However, it's what we call a zoonotic infection. That means it can be transmitted from animals to man. So that's why humans are at risk. And you said, so how do we even get anthrax? So people that are at risk of getting anthrax are usually people that rear animals, hunters that hunt in the wild. Other people at risk are people that work in abattoirs, people that slaughter animals. Again, people that are at risk are people that work in labs, lab scientists that receive specimens from these sick animals and humans as well. And if they don't apply the right infection prevention protocols, they could also get infected. Interestingly, in a few years past, we have actually seen anthrax used as a weapon of bioterrorism in parts of the world. So these are the ways that people can get infected with anthrax.
Can I just add to that? Is it in the kitchens as well? Because obviously the produce goes from one hand to the other. How likely is it to jump into household kitchens?
You ask a fantastic question, because people feel, okay, this is for people in animal husbandry. This has nothing to do with me. However, that sick animal that was slaughtered was sold in the markets, and you purchased it, you brought it to your kitchen, and the same utensils I used to, say, slice your beef or goat's meat is the same utensils that you use to slice your vegetables. So you are at risk. So people that don't practice separation of utensils in their kitchens are also at risk. So it's not just people in animal husbandry or people that work in labs.
All right, Doctor, I was also reading that anthrax is said to occur naturally in soil, which the animals feed on, like the grass you've already mentioned, which begs the question, is our vegetation in danger here right now? Because we don't know the amount of vegetation that might have in terms of crops and everything. And as you know, the farmers always go there, to pick the crops and everything. But they harvest it. So how much of a danger are we in right now? Do we have statistics to actually gauge the severity of this problem?
The truth is anthrax exists all over the world. It can actually survive in the environment for decades. So what it does to protect itself, it forms a shell around itself, forming what we call a spore. So that spore can actually survive in soil, in parts of the environment for many decades. So what usually happens in other parts of the world is animals are actually vaccinated regularly. So it's not a public health issue in parts of the world, but in parts of the world like Nigeria, where that is not part of the protocol, so some of our animals can be at risk. So what usually happens is, for example, there's flooding. So the soil is disturbed and it washes the spores into vegetation. Animals feed on the vegetation and then they get sick. So it's everywhere. It's all over the world.
But what about you mentioned the fact that the vaccination, can you vouch for the efficacy of this vaccination, and why don't we have it regularly here as well?
So the vaccine is efficacious, most definitely. It's a resource availability issue for this part of the world.
Okay.
So because you have to purchase the vaccines and you have to administer the vaccines regularly. So the vaccine administration, for it to be done regularly and for it to be monitored, it requires a lot of resources. And I think we're yet to get there.
Okay.
Well, so what's the way forward? The vaccinations seem to be the healthiest way to prevent against this. How is it possible to get rid of this anthrax issue we have right now and prevent it from happening in the future if we don't vaccinate the animals?
Aside from vaccination, there are other preventive protocols. So one thing is what I'm doing right now, educating the public, the risks of the disease and what you can do to protect yourself. So let's look at it from the time that the animal is reared. So people that rear animals, they need to be very observant. If an animal is sick, for example, they need to report it. People that work in Federal Ministry of Agriculture, for example, they need to be very vigilant at this point. People that work in One Health, they need to be very vigilant to monitor these places that animals are reared. So that's one level. Another level is people that rear animals, they need to be able to protect themselves. Let's say if you have a cot, you need to make sure you don't come in contact with animal or animal products, or you cover your cot. If you identify a sick animal, do not slaughter the animal, because when you slaughter the animal, you throw up the spores in the air and spores can be inhaled and the individual will get sick. So those of us that, the regular man on this or woman on the streets, when you buy your animal produce from the market, make sure you're buying from reputable sources. When you bring it home, make sure that you always wash your hands, separate your utensils. Don't use the same cutting board, for example, that you use to cut your meat, to cut your vegetables, because you put yourself at risk. So these are some of the things that we can do to protect ourselves.
Definitely. I was going to ask you about the probability of anthrax being airborne, as it were, but you've just alluded to that, especially when it comes to the animals, as it were.
And I also want to also point out that there are actually 3 ways that anthrax can infect an individual. So like I mentioned, like a cut on your skin, for example, is one of the ways. Another way is if you ingest let's say, parts of a sick animal, for example, you can get infected. And the third way is if you inhale the spores of the anthrax, you can get infected.
I know she was going to ask you about the...
I know where she's very important questions for you.
I know where she's going.
Can I go ahead?
Go ahead.
So whenever there are these types of outbreaks, the first agenda or food item that is on the list for confiscation is suya, which is, I feel very terrible as being one of my favorite foods.
As well.
But how do people treat these meats that are now sold on the road and grilled? To my understanding, the heat and the carcinogens kill a large number of these spores.
Yes.
But from a health expert, because
Yes.
people have been saying that we shouldn't be eating meat, or don't eat guinea fowl, don't eat all of this. Is it safe?
So I would say, first of all, if you want to buy your suya, buy from a reputable source. Like, you're not buying from some person selling on the street that you're not sure of how they prepare their meats. There are places where you can buy your suya and like you're a little bit more comfortable.
Right.
But if you feel that, okay, I'm going to take a step back from eating suya for now, it's also not a bad decision because I mean, even the person that is reputable, you can't vouch 100%. But like you said, once the thing is thrown on the fire and it's properly grilled, it should get rid of the anthrax bacteria. So make sure you get your suya from a reputable source.
You just made my Saturday.
Indeed, good luck to getting it from there. Anyway, so it's a little bit worrying when you talked about the longevity of the spores, able to protect themselves.
Yes.
They could hibernate for a long time, as it were. So, in that instance, how do we prevent this from becoming an epidemic? Yes, you've already mentioned some steps in this regard, but that feeling of it's still there.
Yes.
I was still talking about the aftermath of COVID, where we're still battling with it at some point in time. And then this, and then the realization of it can be weaponized. We've seen even in the US every now and then, post office anthrax being sent in mails and all that. And, we're still in a bit of a challenge here.
So let me allay your fears a little bit. The first piece of good news is anthrax is actually very rare.
Okay.
It's very rare. Like we haven't had, at least known to us, a case of anthrax in Nigeria in decades. So it's actually a very rare disease. That's number one. Number two, anthrax is treatable. With antibiotics, yes.
Yeah.
It's treatable
that's good. That's
with
good to know.
antibiotics. And the third piece of good news is it's not contagious.
Okay.
Yeah. So if, for example, someone has, say, anthrax that affects your lungs and the person is coughing, you can't get infected by being in the same room.
Okay.
So it's really not. The only way that you can have human-to-human transmission is, let's say, someone has anthrax sores on their skin and you have a cut on your skin and you go rub, who will do that? However, we found out that injection drug users have become infected with anthrax. So it's rare, really. So I believe that's comforting, and it's amenable to antibiotics. Yes.
Wow, Dr.
Yes.
Blossom, thank you so much for coming in and giving us the ins and outs of anthrax and how to spot it and how it's treated. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.